SDGs Conference 2023, Transforming Our World, September 20th, 2023. The SDGs Conference 2023 focuses on three major areas. Panel 2 undertakes a review of press freedom as an instrument to defend human rights for all. Free, independent, and pluralistic media is fundamental for any functioning democracy, and it is also essential for the protection of all forms of human rights. Increasing repression and violations of media freedom are observed in many states in different forms. Control and pressure over the content of media, journalists who are deprived of their liberty, and harassment, intimidation, violence, and even murder of journalists. Therefore, Panel 2 will discuss the following themes: a decade of decline in the global press freedom, freedom on the internet and social media with digital transformations, rising threats for journalists, politicized judiciaries and online harassment, disinformation campaigns, and states' use of media as a tool for propaganda, gender-based violence and violations against women journalists. At the end of the SDGs conference, the JWF and its global partners will propose a framework for action for the next 7 years to improve local and national policies and practices based on the assessment of the progress made towards the achievement of the SDGs. We believe that providing innovative solutions, developing effective strategies, and offering policy recommendations will advance sustainable peace and development worldwide. The Journalists and Writers Foundation and its global partners remain committed to transforming our world through partnerships for the goals.
Independent journalists, credible media outlets are the first on the front line that authoritarian regimes attack as they proceed to undermine democracy. Populists do know that defining their battle for power is built on a foundation to control the narrative in the society. And attacks on press freedom is a transnational agenda. Therefore, it binds us all. We should all be concerned about the shrinking space of journalists and media outlets. Governments which do not uphold press freedom continue their oppression and harassment on dissident journalists across the far-end geographies. Decline of freedom to access knowledge, shrinking space of civil society, disabling the independence of media members never be idle. These systemic violations do spread out across the borders eventually. As free flow of information and well-functioning governments are the pillars of positive peace, we have to respond to the alarming facts that today politicized judiciaries, online surveillance systems, attacks on journalists through social media platforms are the new conflict zones for journalists. And now at panel discussion 2, we have an excellent round of speakers who are about to shed a light on these contemporary challenges. To lead the discussion today, we have Tania Bozaninou, a journalist from Greece, working since 1997 for Vima on Sunday as its editor-in-chief. Ms. Tania covers a variety of topics from diplomacy, foreign affairs to human rights and migration. She has reported from several countries in the Middle East, including Afghanistan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, and Europe. Tania, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I thank the Journalists and Writers Foundation for choosing this topic, because freedom of speech and freedom of information is something we take for granted in democratic societies, but we shouldn't. And you will find out why, I hope. I will begin my speech by giving you two definitions of the freedom of the press, not because I think you don't know what press freedom is, but because I want to show you the evolution of the definition through the decades. The first definition is by George Orwell, who lived in the first half of the 20th century. According to him, freedom of the press means the freedom to criticize and oppose. As simple as that. But definitions of the 21st century describe press freedom as the ability of journalists to select, produce, and disseminate news independent of political, economic, legal, and social interference, and in the absence of threats to their physical and mental safety. So, as you can see, the definition of press freedom had to be broadened in this century in order to encompass the more complex threats that journalists face today. This year, World Press Freedom Index, which evaluates 180 countries, found that unfortunately the environment for journalism is bad in 7 out of 10 countries in the world and satisfactory in only 3 out of 10 countries. The entire American continent, including the United States, no longer has any country where press freedom is deemed good. In the Asia Pacific, there are some of the worst countries regarding freedom. In Africa, nearly half of the countries are problematic. And last in the regional ranking is the Middle East and North Africa, which continue to be the world's most dangerous region for journalists. Europe continues to be the best continent to work as a journalist, but even there, the situation is problematic. Even in Germany, which has a good ranking in the Press Freedom Index, Germany is number 21 out of 180 countries, a record number of cases of violence against journalists were recorded last year. So, apart from the traditional threats that curtail press freedom, murder and attacks against journalists, there are many more modern threats and subtler threats, and this is the tricky part, that might not harm journalists physically, but they do harm press freedom. For example, one easy example is that in 2 out of 3 countries, politicians are involved in massive disinformation or propaganda campaigns, which result in blurring the difference between true and false. And this is made possible thanks to new technology. But apart from new technology, those who want to mess with press freedom have many, many tools in their disposal right now. I would like to introduce you to just 2 of them. One is media capture. I don't know if you are familiar with the term, but media capture describes the way politicians and businessmen collaborate in order to control the media. Instead of a government to directly control or close down a newspaper or a TV station because they are too critical of its policies, it colludes with friendly businessmen who buy the newspaper or the website or the TV station. And under the new owner, the medium stops being critical of the government, and the journalists who don't comply are simply fired. Media capture is one of the gravest and most intractable new threats to press freedom around the world. In country after country, collusion between governments and wealthy media owners has become the preferred method of control over the media. In countries such as Hungary, Turkey, and Russia, media capture is already the dominant form of media ownership. The second new tool to curtail press freedom I would like to mention to you is SLAPS. It's an acronym which means Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, or more simply, intimidation lawsuits. These are lawsuits against journalists or human rights defenders with the purpose to censor, intimidate, and silence them by burdening them with legal costs. In a typical SLAP case, the plaintiff does not even care to win the lawsuit, because the goal is not to win, but to exhaust the journalist financially and emotionally with mounting legal costs, so that the journalists themselves decide to stop being critical. SLAPs are a very real threat to press freedom, even in places where journalists are generally respected, such as in Western Europe. The people who want to control and annoying journalists are mostly politicians and public servants. They use strategic lawsuits, often based on over-strict libel laws or vague privacy rules, and more often than not, they succeed to silence their targets. But I would like to end on a positive note. In an effort to stop such misuse of the legal system, the European Commission, which, by the way, in a very superficial count, they found hundreds of slaps cases in the last couple of years. So the European Commission, and they're sure there are many more that couldn't be counted, so the European Commission drafted an anti-slap directive that will be adopted hopefully next year. And in the United States, in more than 30 American states, Canada and Australia have already anti-slap laws in place. And with this positive note, I would like to give the floor to our distinguished guests. First, Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the opinion editor of Newsweek and a writer of books like the forthcoming Promised Land, The Working Class Struggle for the American Dream. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I am truly, truly humbled to have been asked to speak here and to be in such august company. This panel is called Press Freedom as an Instrument to Defend Human Rights for All, and I am specifically to talk about the state of press freedom under autocratic regimes and the state's control of media as a venue for propaganda. I want to start by saying that there are many autocratic regimes across the globe that you'll hear about here that don't recognize freedom of the press or even the sanctity of human life, where speaking the truth can cost a journalist his or her freedom. I'm thinking a lot, as I'm sure a lot of us are, about Evan Gershkovich, an American Wall Street Journal reporter who was imprisoned by Russia. These countries routinely inflict human and civil rights abuses against journalists, and it's unspeakable. 12 journalists, for example, were reportedly killed last year for reporting on the war in Ukraine and Russia. 13 journalists were killed in Mexico in 2022. And nothing that I am about to say should be seen as in any way making an equivalence between what happens in those countries and what happens in Western democracies. Human rights abuses against journalists, murder, a culture of violence and impunity are atrocities that cannot be compared to anything else. But we are not here to discuss state violence, but rather state suppression of speech. And when it comes specifically to press freedom and to state control of the media as a tool of propaganda, unfortunately, many democratic regimes have begun to engage in a culture of repression and recrimination, often ironically in the name of fighting misinformation and disinformation. Now, again, I want to be extremely clear, this is in no way comparable to killing and jailing journalists or allowing cartels to get away with killing and torturing journalists. And yet, when a government engages in efforts to suppress the truth about those in power and is met by a willing journalistic caste that has decided to assist in this suppression, in the name of fighting misinformation, for example, you can end up with a similar effect when it comes to the electorate. In other words, if the point of a free press is a free electorate whose freedom is in part predicated upon some level of being informed, then the sad truth is that journalism can be stifled by journalists if they are unwilling to stand up to government overreach, even when that overreach does not come in the form of imprisonment or physical threats. And what we've learned in the US of late is that social threats, social status, and class solidarity can have a similar chilling effect on free speech and a commitment to diversity of thought. Autocrats are very adept at suffocating free speech and a free press with state-sponsored violence, but in democracies, class interests can also suppress free speech, and while perhaps not as evil, terrifying, or vile as physical violence, it can result in a similarly conformist and unfree civic society, one that should horrify people committed to a free press, especially we Americans with our First Amendment. In the U.S., state agencies have routinely intervened to spread or silence journalistic stories of late. Most famously, I'll just give one example of how this happened in the name of fighting misinformation. In the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, left what we now know by his own admission was his laptop, which contained compromising information in a computer repair shop. The laptop was full of images of Hunter in compromising positions, as well as emails that showed a vast enterprise of influence peddling with representatives of foreign governments. Some of them are adversaries that may have implicated Joe Biden. We don't know yet. So this is all now fact. We know now that this is fact, and yet when this story first came out, it was vigorously ignored voluntarily by the mainstream legacy press, so much so that as a candidate, President Biden was never even asked to deny that this was his son's laptop, which it turned out it was. Instead of robust coverage, the media ran cover for the Biden campaign, which also colluded with a former acting director of the CIA. Again, this is all reported, this is his own admission, who got 50 intelligence officials to spread the lie, we now know, that the laptop was Russian disinformation. Twitter then locked the account of the newspaper that had published the story to keep that vital information from spreading. So this is just one example. Emails have subsequently revealed how often the Biden administration reached out to social media companies like Twitter and Facebook, successfully petitioning them to ban the accounts of established journalists for the sin of publishing stories unfavorable to the administration. The White House successfully petitioned Facebook to remove posts discouraging people from getting the COVID vaccine or discussing what turned out to be the almost certain actual origin of COVID-19, and others were booted from Twitter at the White House behest. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't mind that this happened because I don't agree with those positions, you're in good company. Autocrats also are very good at protecting the free speech of people who agree with them. The U.S. government participated in this regime of censorship so aggressively that recently a federal appeals court said that the Biden administration had violated the First Amendment. And again, I want to make very clear, none of this comes close to jailing or killing journalists. But again, we are not here to discuss the evils of murder, but rather the evils of suppressing the freedom of the press and speech. Silencing speech is against our Constitution. It's all the more egregious when that speech turns out to be true, and yet was silenced for political purposes. And of course, the test of free speech is always when it comes to speech you disagree with. Again, it's, every autocrat can protect the speech of people they agree with. The worst part is that the media in America has been completely complicit in all of this. None of this would have been possible if the media had simply stood up to what were, after all, rather benign requests from a democratic government, or even no requests at all, as in the case of the Hunter Biden laptop story. In repressive regimes, the media is forced to report things that they know are lies. But here, the tragedy is that members of the media caste have come to believe whatever the administration wants them to, and the reason for that is very simple. Capture. The American media has become deeply captured by a socioeconomic elite that is almost uniformly ultra-progressive, and which no longer believes that free speech is an absolute value, and that political debate is the sacred bedrock of a democracy. Some 96% of American journalists who gave political donations gave them to the Democratic Party, even though they only get 25% of the electorate's vote, okay? So 96% of journalists speaking from the same position of a quarter of Americans. The majority of them have graduate degrees. They make at least twice the median income, although most of them make much more, and vanishingly few of them believe that those they disagree with deserve to make their case unimpeded to the American people, and a lot of that is being done again, and they use the term misinformation, disinformation to push a political and economic agenda. As such, American journalists routinely end up protecting the very people they are meant to be holding to account while smearing and silencing the working class, who tend to be more socially conservative. American journalists are now on the side of those in power. They go to the same elite universities as the tech billionaires and politicians they're supposed to cover, and their children end up in the same elite schools, and they end up in the same neighborhoods. At the same time, 97% of political donations that came out of Silicon Valley went to, surprise, surprise, the Democratic Party, 97%. So there are two ways to stop the truth from emerging in a free press. One is to kill and jail journalists, but it turns out that there is actually another way, and it is to wait for them to become part of the same elites that benefit from the status quo, and then they have a vested interest in protecting the lives of those in power to whom their own status is bound, making them reactionary conservatives who will defend the Biden administration or the Obama administration before them. So this panel is about the UN General Assembly Sustainable Development Goals, which are noble goals, things like, significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. But the American press wouldn't report that the skyrocketing levels of violent crime plaguing low-income Americans, especially Black Americans, and here's the worst part about it, they did not need to be told by a Democratic administration not to report on the crime wave, which is highly localized in democratic cities. They didn't have to be threatened with prison to not report on it. It came naturally to them. It is how they protect their elite status with ideas like defund the police, which proliferated in 2020 and 2021. And if you were a working journalist who knew people whose lives had been destroyed by crime and dared to speak up against it, you were ostracized, humiliated, and shamed into silence by your fellow journalists. Stories about crime are rife with misinformation and racism, they declared at the federally funded NPR, a sentiment that was echoed over and over at the legacy media. Now imagine being the victim of rape or carjacking, or the family member of a person who was murdered and having to read that headline. I'm sure everybody here thinks education is a vital goal, yet thanks to the censorship of the Biden administration, a compliant press, and complicit social media companies, the disastrous impact of learning loss due to school lockdowns on low-income children was hidden from view, as was how little children were in danger of negative outcomes from COVID. It will take a generation for Black children to make up the impact of losing 2 years of school while rich white kids were back in school within 6 months. And during these lockdowns, which got no pushback by the mainstream media, physical abuse of children skyrocketed, so did suicide attempts. Or what about Target 5.2, eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. One thing you will not read about in the American media is the fact that 1/3 of all women crossing our southern border illegally admits to being raped. So imagine what the actual number is a third of these women admits that they were raped on the way here, including children as young as 8 years old. Under President Biden, the U.S. is seeing more human trafficking and more sex trafficking than we have, certainly in my lifetime, probably in our entire history. Why don't you hear about it in the press? Class solidarity, American journalists are in the class that consumes cheap illegal migrant labor, not the class who are competing for those jobs. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are many ways for a regime to control the media for purposes of propaganda, and not all of them are violent. Not all of them occur under autocracies. A functioning democracy can have a dysfunctional press. All it takes is for the people tasked with holding power to account to get a taste of power, to cultivate deep, deep contempt for the citizens they are meant to be informing. All it takes is for journalists to think it is their job to tell people how to think or what to value instead of supplying them with facts so they can make up their own minds the way you do with somebody you respect, which is what I've tried very hard to do here. Autocrats have contempt for human life and human rights, but nothing compares to the atrocity that represents and the atrocities it results in. But if you have contempt for the values of your fellow man because they don't agree with you, you can end up robbing them of the truth too, and using journalism to spread misinformation in the name of defending the truth. And I hope this goes without saying to me, but for an American, the government should never, ever be involved in the business of fighting misinformation. Our entire country is sort of built on that idea. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Batya. And now I give the floor to Paula Penfold, an investigative journalist based in Auckland, New Zealand, who reports for the video-led team at Staff, the country's largest media organization.
Thank you, Tania. Tēnā koutou katoa, a greeting in Te Reo Māori, our Indigenous language in New Zealand, to acknowledge you all. Thank you very much to the Journalists and Writers Foundation and to the Peace of the Islands Foundation for having me here. People probably think that nothing much bad happens in New Zealand. I see we're fourth on the scale in terms of peaceful countries in the world. The World Press Freedom, as you've heard Tania speak of the index for 2023, we're ranked in New Zealand number 13 on that. We're described as a model for public interest journalism. We apparently benefit from a high degree of press freedom. And it is true, relatively speaking, in the same way that you've just been hearing, no journalist has died in New Zealand because of our profession. There are no state-sponsored invasions of reporters' homes or extrajudicial imprisonments. But unfortunately, the World Press Freedom Index is wrong when it says journalists in New Zealand work in an environment free from violence and intimidation, because we don't. Increasingly, there is an insidious threat, and it's not the state that's the problem in our country. It is our fractured society and a growing, I was going to say distrust, but it is much more than that now. It is a growing hatred towards journalists. And that is a hatred born disproportionately by women journalists. And the media sometimes doesn't help itself, it is true, and that happens in our country also. But my brief today is to speak about gendered violence, and so I want to step back briefly to 2013, when my colleagues and I began investigating a man's wrongful conviction, New Zealand's biggest miscarriage of justice at the time, for rape and murder. I work in a small team and I was the only woman. So when an email arrived saying that I was infatuated with the convict, I took note. My male producers and colleagues didn't receive the same email. I found it distasteful, but I put it to one side. 10 years on, if only things were still so quaint. Last year we investigated societal issues in New Zealand, and we made a documentary called Fire and Fury. It came about because of a protest inspired by the truckers' convoy in Canada. Thousands of freedom movement protesters converged on our capital city, Wellington, and they set up camp in our Parliament grounds. We were familiar with some of the key players, some of the leaders of that movement, and we knew that it wasn't, as they were calling it, a protest of peace and love. It was a recruitment drive, and we watched as ordinary New Zealanders became radicalised and the language became more violent. A key concern uniting them, by the way, was their belief that Agenda 2030 was part of a global elite plot. And so when we started to see some of those leaders use the term ungovernable, that is, that they wanted to make the country ungovernable, and others were calling for a military coup, which is not language that you hear in New Zealand, we knew it was something that we needed to be there to start filming. And so we went to Wellington on the day, coincidentally, that the police moved in to end the protest, and it turned into a violent riot, the likes of which our country had never ever seen, in the very seat of our democracy. When we have reported in countries like Afghanistan, we get security training, of course, to keep ourselves safe before we go. But we used that training more in Wellington that day, in our capital city, than we ever have in places like Afghanistan or in the Philippines or in Mexico, where just being a journalist puts a target on your back. We were abused, we were intimidated, we were escorted out of the protest just because we were journalists. This isn't a public place, this is in our Parliament grounds. We were moved off the grounds by angry people who just did not want journalists there. And so we found another way in. We went back into the protest on the other side. And once the fires started in our Parliament grounds, and once the gas canisters from the tents started exploding, and we found ourselves filming in a no man's land between the advancing riot police on one side and the angry protesters throwing whatever missiles they could find at the police, we knew it was time to leave, because our security training had drilled into us to always have an exit route. The violence and intimidation that we received that day was directed at all journalists, but what came in the wake of that documentary was plainly gendered, because again, out of our small team, I was the only one that received it as the woman, and it was also very clear from the language. That's a very small sample from thousands that arrived just in my email inbox, not to mention what was happening on social media and on Telegram. And when I was informed by a source that one of the subjects of that documentary, Fire and Fury, had my home address, my company put my family and me into hiding while we beefed up the already improved security at my home. This, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we pride ourselves on press freedom and where we're ranked 13th best in the world. We do report some of these threats to the police. And sometimes a local officer from the police station will ring and say, "Do you feel safe at the moment?" And I usually say, yeah, right now I do. And that's the end of it. There is never any proper investigation or inquiry into who's making those threats. Those of us who are frequently updating what is known as our police 10 files, deaths. New Zealand, just like so many jurisdictions, is not legislatively equipped to deal with this new violent, threatening world order against journalists. And on the rare occasions that people are charged, it doesn't go as it should in court. One person we investigated for that documentary was arrested in March last year on charges of threatening to kill the then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. He also has me and many other journalists on his Nuremberg list of those he says should be brought before a military tribunal for crimes against humanity. He was released on bail, but he failed to turn up for his next court appearance, and he's been on the run from the police ever since. And he keeps on updating that Nuremberg list, so somewhere he's online. And the police just won't tell us, in spite of our Freedom of Information Act requests, what they're doing to try to catch him. Male journalists are abused too, of course, and they're put on those Nuremberg lists. But the research shows that they don't suffer the same degree of abuse and harassment as women journalists do, nor the sexually violent abuse. And it's worse, as always, for women of colour. And it becomes even more concerning for those of us on the receiving end of these threats in light of recent research in New Zealand, which surveyed 2,000 people and found disturbingly that 8% believed threatening to hurt someone is an acceptable way to achieve change. The same survey revealed that 54% of respondents who strongly believe in misinformation have avoided or stopped watching mainstream news and are actively encouraged to not consume mainstream media, although I don't like the term mainstream media anymore because it has been so weaponised in this environment in our country of what they like to call alternative media, which really just actually serves to provide a platform for the further dissemination of many of those threats. The tentacles of this fake news discourse really have reached all the way to the South Pacific, and they're strangling us, let me tell you. And I've come to realise that it's not happening in spite of us being a liberal democracy. It's happening because we are a liberal democracy. It is the same continuum, the same mechanisms through which authoritarianism is rising throughout the world. That is why we're being targeted as journalists. And we know sometimes the sources of the information on which that's based. So what is the result? The result is a chilling effect, obviously. And this is where so many of us as journalists are conflicted, and we struggle because, of course, we don't want to be silenced. And yet, every time we put our heads above the parapet, particularly on social media, and no matter how strong your blocking game might be, the attacks begin, and they are vile. They are vile attacks. And so consciously or not, you do reduce your presence. You think and you think again about telling some stories, and it really is driving some journalists from the industry. And when you stop to consider, in the context of gendered attacks on journalists, that misogyny is not only or necessarily about hatred towards or of women, it is about control of women, then this is a victory for those who wish to silence us and the stories that we wish to freely tell. Senior figures, even in a country like New Zealand, in the media, senior figures worry about this. Of course, my former boss, a 30-year veteran, wrote in a piece last year that when the ballistic grading of windows in one of our newsroom was discussed at a management meeting, he realised that things had changed. They see these online threats towards us, and they see the stress that they engender. And they too worry about whether those threats will transfer to real life. So what do we do about it? rebuilding trust, obviously, in media is key, not just for our financial survival, which is imperiled, but potentially for our literal survival, being transparent about our processes, advocating in each of our jurisdictions for better legislation to protect us in the face of this increasing violence. And obviously, which has already been referred to today, encouraging media literacy. It needs a whole of society approach because this problem does not just affect us as journalists. It undermines the very foundation of our role in democracies, and we can't fix it alone. I do feel encouraged, though, that while this hate and distrust and gendered and all forms of violence towards journalists is at unprecedented levels, the craft does remain, and it continues to be pursued in our country and throughout the world with excellence. And so I stay, in spite of it all, because I continue to believe that what we do matters. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Paula. I give the floor to Abdulhamit Bilici. He's the former editor-in-chief of Zaman newspaper. Zaman newspaper has been closed down several years ago by President Erdogan. Mr. Bilici, he's an expert on Turkish politics, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tania. So, thanks for the invitation and for the conference and raising this very vital issue of press freedom. My case indeed will be very easy because if I introduce myself only, it will be sufficing to tell how awful the situation when there is no press freedom. So I used to be editor-in-chief of the largest Turkish newspaper, which is not existing anymore. So it's not even a yellow journal. It's not a mouthpiece newspaper. Even our archives are deleted. So I used to be writing in that newspaper columns twice per week, and now I can't find those articles. And this is the smallest part of it, because some of my colleagues are still in jail. So I am lucky, although I am in exile for 7 years. And of course, even that doesn't describe the situation, because it is not just my newspaper, but 200 media outlets has been shut down in last 7 years, especially after 2016 coup attempt. So Turkey became, once upon a time, the biggest jailer of the journalists in the world. And unfortunately, the guy who is responsible from all those, now we are in the same town. So as victim and the oppressor, and I'm sure now maybe he is lecturing the world about peace, justice, and very good values. So I think, I like to put the relationship between the human rights situation in any country and the press freedom. And it's very, very significant to share that statistics. So Turkey indeed was not that terrible, of course. If those who follow international relations will remember, Turkey was a rising star just 10 years ago, not a long distance. It was a model of rising democracy. It was an economic success story in a very volatile, very chaotic world. It's not the case now. So I'll share two statistics to make your conclusions. How is the relationship between press freedom and the rule of law, human rights, or the justice? So Turkey now ranks 165 out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom, according to World Press Freedom Index. 165 out of 180. And in 2014, now I'll share another statistics. This is also very, very significant. Turkey was 59th out of 126 countries. This is a rule of law index, a global index telling us about the quality of justice in any country. So Turkey was in the mid-level. But now, after 6-7 years, after this destruction of the press freedom, where is Turkey now in that index? So Turkey is now 117th out of 139. So almost 40 countries down in terms of quality of justice, rule of law, and human rights. So, I mean, when I listen to my colleagues' observations about the United States, Greece, and New Zealand, I mean, it's kind of day and night, I think. I mean, it's not comparable, but it's all, I'm also learning that there's always some problems to focus and to talk and to work in progress. Why? Because you know, there's a very important quote from George Orwell, who described what is journalism. So he said, journalism is printing what someone else doesn't want to be printed. Any other thing is public relations. So nothing to do with journalism. Which means, if journalism is to print something that some people do not like to be printed, it is a default fact that you will be targeted. You will not be liked. So this is a kind of given for a real journalist, if we do our job. But the scale of the being targeted, being attacked, being not liked may be different. In my case, my newspaper was shut down. I am in exile. And in some friends' case, they are being killed just because telling things, writing things that some sources of power do not like. So it may be a government, it may be a political leader, it may be a mafia boss, it may be leader of a company or a clan or a tribe, whatever. So it may be different. But I mean, the nature of the journalism has that intrinsic in it. So because you do think that is disturbing some people. So this, of course, there are different levels of, as I said, the threat, damage, and problems. But as I said, there is a strong relationship between the press freedom and the human rights and rule of law. But of course, it's not a one-way street. So if there is press freedom, the journalists will respect rule of law, human rights. This is not the case. So I'll tell you some examples that from my country again, from my previous country, that there was kind of relatively freedom, but media was not using this in some cases, not to support the human rights, but sometimes to destroy it. Just a couple of examples. For instance, one Armenian colleague of mine, who was a journalist, Hrant Dink, who was assassinated by some ultra-nationalist groups, but they have been targeted first by a very mainstream newspaper. So with a silly story, so they put him into target. This was the starting point of him being killed at the end of the process. And there was a very popular singer, who the Turkish audience will know very well, Ahmet Kaya, whose exile process and his death in Paris was started again after him being targeted by media. So there has been some other prominent journalists, some intellectuals, who has been targeted in cooperation between the security agencies of the Turkish state, which this was much before AKP Erdogan, and media. So some, for instance, some terrorist groups, real terrorist groups, were taking their testimonies. So those security agencies, some secret police, some maybe military, fabricated, doctored some prominent journalists' names into those testimonies, and they lost their jobs and they became targets. And of course, these stories were published by those mainstream medias. So, I mean, it is not, if there is media freedom, it doesn't mean that all journalists, all media will use that freedom to support human rights. So it is not given. So for this, in the newspaper that I was the editor, we had some special policies. You know, when you consider Turkey, it is, as many countries, there are different groups, there are minorities, there are groups that are not looked very positively by the official ideology. So what we did, we had some intentional policies to contribute to human rights, not to eliminate it. So one of those attempts was to invite columnists, reporters from different backgrounds to be present in our newsrooms and to write their views in the newspaper. So in Turkey we have an Armenian minority, a Greek minority, of course a very big majority of Kurds, but still minority. So we had intellectuals from those groups having their views shared freely in the paper, which was a training and education for us, for all our staff, that those people are here. We need to empathize, we need to understand their situations, and they were writing the problems from their own perspectives. So this was an important attempt to do it so. So other than that, you know, the established media in Turkey, 95% of it was controlled by two families. It is again before AKP and Erdogan. And it was working together with the establishment, the secular, bureaucratic, military understanding that doesn't look much positively to pious people, to Kurdish people, to some minority groups. So that was a big problem. So we said in the newspaper that whenever we see a story that looks like fabricated or fake, we could send a reporter to investigate the truth about it. So first book that we published in the newspaper was collection of those fake stories and their correct versions as a book. So those kind of things. So my newspaper was compared to some established medias in Turkey, was a recent newspaper, a young newspaper. It was established in 1980s, mid-1980s. But we have newspapers having 80 years of history. So we had the trainings of our reporters about the human rights awareness. You know, the human journalists are not angels. So we may have some biases. We have. So we need to have all this education and training to not to make mistakes, or to make mistakes. It's not possible in journalism to be mistake-free, but to at least not to do big mistakes. So with that kind of training and awareness, it helped us very much. So sometimes we do mistakes without being aware of what we are doing. So the journalism and the journalist in general is a kind of a club. You know, here Batya shared how the American media, American journalists are part of a big club. You know, 97% of them supporting Democratic Party, which means a very much homogeneous group. This is the case in many countries. So it's very important to be able to reach out to different people that are living in the same society. So that was a very big problem. And the founders of my newspapers, one of the priorities was to change perspective in the media and to reach out to other people that were neglected before. Not to be populist, but just to give them chance to express themselves. So, for instance, when we, of course, my newspaper's history goes back before Erdogan and AKP. But first, when the newspaper was established, it was attacked by the secular establishment because it was an outside and new player in the game. And it was a tiny newspaper when it started. But it became largest newspaper in 10, 15 years because we went to people. So we had strong relations, and this was appreciated by the community. So it is, I mean, the case of Zaman, the newspaper, shows that it is possible. Even if you are not happy with the existing media's establishment, you can start something from new. But you need to have good principles. So the newspaper was having those problems. So when AKP was founded, when Erdogan was the leader of that party, and we felt their approach, their perspective very close to ours. They were having some pious backgrounds, but they were open to the world. So they were pushing for Turkey to be European Union member. So they were progressive. They had a conservative background, but they had progressive policies. So we gave full support to this party and to this leader until 2013. So when in 2013 we had this corruption scandal, when we discovered the corruption scandal, so we had to write about that, and that is the beginning of the decline of Turkish democracy and my victimhood and also my colleagues' victimhood. So you can, if you can see, the Turkey in 2013 and Turkey in 2023, it's like day and night. So you can check any international statistics about press freedom, about justice, about human development, about the economy, so everything. So my conclusion is that Turkey was becoming a good example of Muslim democracy rising in a very troubled area. But now it is also another example how press freedom and democracy, human rights is very much related. You can't have it you can't have a democracy, human rights without it. So this is a very good example to study and to learn, not to have the same mistakes in other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdulhamit. Before we go on to our next speaker, I would like to read two comments from the internet audience. The first one is for Batya. I think it is characteristic of the erosion of the trust of the public to the media. So the comment goes, media has a way of reporting what they want to report as opposed to reporting what is actually going on. Gone are the reporters that had integrity. what we have now are self-serving hacks who are trying to make a name for themselves rather than report fairly.
At this table are reporters who I have so much respect for the work that they do and just the struggles they've been through. So I think on this dais at this table there are people that perhaps you would be able to respect. I will say that there's a lot of talk here as well that kind of tries to come up with conspiratorial reasons for why the media's failures, but I tend to see a lot of people coming from the best of intentions and getting it wrong for much larger systemic class-based issues. I don't like I said, nobody has to tell them like don't report on this, don't report on that. They think that they're doing the best of their ability. Even the people who I think are like the most dangerous for our democracy, I think they really, most of the time, 90% of the time, they really are trying their best. It's just that they have been misled. And so I disagree a little bit with the comment. I think there are still very good journalists out there trying really hard. I'm very proud of the work we do at Newsweek. We do a lot of what you were doing. We have a daily debate every morning. There's two positions, competing positions on the same idea. But I think that is really what's missing is respect for people you disagree with, which is very hard. I mean, it's very hard. But thank you so much for the comment.
Unfortunately, women are targets in all areas that they work. Unfair treatment of women does not only occur in the media. Women are still fighting for equal pay.
I have not much other to say than 100% agree with you. I'm asked to speak as a journalist, not on behalf of all women today, but I 100% agree that this is an issue that applies to women across the board. On the issue, I mean, there are so many issues that we could speak of in terms of lack of equality for women. Equal pay is one of them. I have no argument with the commenter.
And so we go to our next speaker, Christina Piaia. She's the legal manager for the Protecting Journalists Pro Bono program at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. So, Piaia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to this distinguished panel. It's an honor to be here. As a former journalist, now turned lawyer, I have incredible respect for reporting the news and the incredible difficult work. Today I was asked to speak about the legal harassment that journalists are facing, and I think sometimes we see this on a global scale as something that are attacks against the press, but what I'll talk a little bit about today is how some of these attacks are not being housed in the term of press freedoms, but using different areas of law to target journalists and specifically make it more difficult to do their work. But I do want to take a minute just as an attorney here in the U.S. and working for an organization that supports press freedom here to look at the current landscape of journalists in the U.S. Similar to the World Press Freedom Index, we have a U.S. press freedom tracker that takes a look at what's happening here on the ground for journalists, both from a legal perspective as well as attacks and assaults and imprisonment against journalists. And since 2017, here in the U.S., there have been 1,000 assaults, mostly at the hands of law enforcement, against journalists in the United States. 2020 and 2021, not surprisingly, were exceptionally bad. 630 journalists in 2020 were assaulted, 145 in 2021. And although the numbers are lower this year, we're continue to remain troubled about the state of press freedom here in the U.S., which of course boasts to have the First Amendment and some incredible legal protections for press, but as you can tell from those numbers, not by any means free from issues. And of course, just to mention, top of mind are the recent deaths of 2 journalists here in the U.S. Jeff Gurman, a veteran investigative reporter for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, was killed last September, allegedly by the subject of one of his investigations. A few months after that, Dylan Lyons, a reporter for Spectrum News in Florida, was fatally shot while reporting on the scene. And of course, as we know, journalists should not have to fear reporting this information. They shouldn't have to fear challenging public officials who have been accused or misused their office or betraying the public trust. So it remains crucial to know that these journalists are out there covering these communities, and how we have to make sure that communities are informed and that we hold those in power accountable for their actions. And we see this several ways in the U.S. We have an ability, and a lot of the work that I do is to make sure that we're protecting journalists' access to local records. And so journalists are often thwarted by government officials by obtaining requests for certain government records, and legal protections can help kind of make sure that that critical information is in the hands of journalists as they need it. Turning to more of the legal elements, although again, we have a lot of protections here on the ground in the U.S., journalists have been confronted with a wide range of legal threats here, including subpoenas and prior restraints. For those who might not be familiar with prior restraint, those are court orders that prevent news organizations or journalists from publishing newsworthy information. So they essentially bar journalists from reporting on matters of public interest. And in 2022, we saw several prior restraint cases here in the U.S. Thankfully, some of the judicial system is working, and those most of those were reversed or dissolved. But again, these orders have a significant chilling effect, and unless they're ultimately blocked, they can stop reporters from reporting on crucial stories. And I do want to take a moment to kind of share what I think is a bright spot in journalism here in the U.S. and also across the globe, which is what's always existed, but I think it might be coming more into the public eye, which is local journalism, community reporting, individuals from their community going to open meetings, making sure that they're covering whether it be a school board hearing or how election funds are being spent in their district or community. I've spent most of this past year working on the ground in several states here in the U.S., looking at smaller news organizations, sometimes 2 or 3 journalists, reporting on police accountability, local government officials' abuse. And these individuals are doing such crucial work, and they really are sometimes the eyes and ears of the community. And so I do see kind of a bright spot of local journalism happening across the country. Now, whether or not it's out there if you look for it, but whether or not you can find this local journalism, I think is still a lot of the crucial work that we have to do and make sure that we're looking at all aspects of reporting. But in doing some of this work, what I'm seeing from a legal perspective becoming a threat is the actual status of the organization itself. So as you can imagine, many newspapers have shuttered, news organizations have been dissolved, and individuals are starting to find creative models to encourage news and reporting. And one of the ways that they're doing that is by creating nonprofit institutions that still have the journalistic ethics of a news organization, but they're built in to be able to receive grants and individual donations to cover their reporting. And part of this is because just in general to support what's happening on the ground. And what we're seeing from a legal perspective, unfortunately, is when the reporting of these smaller news organizations, which, as I mentioned, are generally a handful of people, they're almost always from the community, born and raised and living in the communities where they're reporting. They're often working potentially in a language that's not English. And individuals are threatening their nonprofit status. So essentially, without their nonprofit status, they wouldn't be able to report the news because they would have no funding. So we've seen threats against that type of status, kind of a new way to threaten reporting. And then turning globally, similar as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of times press freedom is, governments have become very clever about talking more about press freedom, perhaps even enacting laws across different countries to help show as if they're on the press's side. But I think what's happened is that the legal rhetoric and ways in which press are being threatened have changed. Governments and leaders have learned to talk very expressively about press freedom and protection of journalists, but oftentimes that's other areas of law, often complex and difficult to navigate areas of law, are happening. We've seen this, of course, in like the case of Maria Ressa that faced a barrage of charges from the Philippine government. These charges were a series of criminal and civil cases, including tax evasion, violations of foreign ownership rules, and these areas of law are so complex and so difficult to navigate without expert legal counsel, and they know this. They know that it's difficult to be able to have the funding to do this work. It's difficult to be able, when an individual gets a complaint like this, to be able to even navigate the area of law or how they respond to this request. And thankfully, there is pro bono support for some journalists, but a lot of times these threats aren't related to press freedom laws themselves, but they're criminal cases that involve significant legal action, also legal action that takes years to evaluate and change. And so as an eternal optimist, I just want to close by ending with potentially a few solutions. I think number one, we have to make sure that individuals, journalists, newsrooms, like across the country and the globe, understand how critical legal support and how legal support needs to be an infrastructure that's funded, and whether that's done by civil society, individuals, or community groups. We need to make sure that journalists that are doing this difficult work are supported from a legal perspective. We need to make sure that they have access to legal assistance at every stage of reporting, investigation. As Paula's really meaningful and intimate portrait of her online abuse, we see this constantly for journalists, and many of them don't know what to do, so we have to increase training about how they can be able to help. But even when that happens, potentially law enforcement officials don't even know what to do, or they don't have the bandwidth, or they just don't bother with doing it. And in that vein, we need to make sure that we're growing the bench of attorneys that are serving journalists, making sure that legal counsel is available to mitigate risks and address these non-press freedom areas of law that often include these criminal and complex areas of law. And yeah, those are some of the solutions that a lot of folks are involved in and moving forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Christina. So now I will give the floor to Ivy Murugi from Kenya. She is the Global Youth Representative of the World Organization of the Scout Movement.
Thank you so much. It's an honor being able to speak after these incredible panelists. I wanted to be a journalist when I was growing up, and I don't know whether to be relieved that I did not become one, but I love the resilience that you guys have. I represent a movement of 56 million young people from across the globe, and the world's largest youth contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as a young person from the so-called Generation Z, I see endless opportunities in the digital transformation that is happening around the globe, and I recognize the importance of both social and mainstream media as a tool to connect people, to foster dialogues, ignite change, and hold people accountable. The current media landscape is more diverse, and the industry is attracting high levels of investment in capital in both mainstream and digital media platforms, and this is something I love to see as a young person. And I pay tribute to the vocal and fearless men and women in the media who have had to lose their lives in the spirit of uncovering ills and telling stories of change. And I celebrate a million others, some of them in this panel, who have the willingness to continue informing the world and telling personal stories of amazing people from across the globe. I believe that press freedom is an essential pillar to any democracy, as it provides the platform for a multiplicity of voices to be heard. At national, regional, and local level, you guys are the public's watchdog, activists, and guardians. You're also educators, you're entertainers, and contemporary chroniclers. I have seen the media thrive and do their best in context of both liberal and authoritarian regimes. I come from Kenya. I hope this goes off record. But as you may be aware that we had general elections very recently, and the media did an amazing job in its reporting, and their coverage did give people the confidence to believe in the final tallies that were given, especially for the very tightly contested presidential seat. But sadly, a few months down, one of the cabinet appointees of the current president made full utterances on one of the media houses in Kenya who have been very brave in uncovering truths and telling stories without fear. In two case scenarios, but I'll speak about one. In one of them, he said, XX Media Group, you must now decide whether you are a newspaper, a broadcasting house, a media house, or a political party. I have said from tomorrow, from today even, the government, any government department that is found placing an advertisement with media group so-and-so should consider itself out of the government. These are some of the media capture and intimidation lawsuits that Ms. Tania was talking about. But I'm sure, I am more than sure that this is just but one of the many existing situations in so many contexts, with some having it more rough than others from the statistics that we had. And the fundamental right to seek and disseminate information through an independent press is under attack, not just in Kenya, the example that I gave, but in so many other contexts. The threats have taken new dimensions as they are publicly defended and even boldly justified by some of these perpetrators. Elected leaders who should be press freedom's staunchest defenders have explicitly tried to silence critical media voices. Despite the robust legislation, media freedoms have been constantly curtailed. Freedom from the press is a right that every entity in society must care about and commit to protecting. Press freedom can rebound from even lengthy states of repression when given the opportunity, and in this regard, there is need for sustained conversations and multi-sectoral approaches to achieve a free press in all contexts, and I hope that the discussions today can be able to spark actionable ways to be able to do this. Governments should not interfere with this freedom or censor media that's critical of state power. We need to safeguard press freedom and promote freedom of expression to ensure and facilitate global democracy, uphold the rule of law and human rights for all. Journalists, please remember that people are more often than not going to take opinions as facts, but you're the remedy to this, setting this right. So keep on fighting for the truth and holding those in power accountable. Be the watchdog that sheds light on wrongdoing, even in the wake of a shrinking media space. Keep giving accurate, fair, and unbiased information. As Paula said, what you do matters.
Thank you, Ivy. We have a few minutes left, and I invite you to ask any question if you have, or make a comment.
How does it feel now, how do you think you can go on from here to, let's say, a better and a safer place to be later on, hopefully?
I mean, you know, when I left Turkey as an exiled journalist, I did drive for Uber for 3 years. And I was telling my story to my passengers, and they were shocked most of the time. Some of them, they were crying, and they were not able to understand. You know, you can see it in a movie. But you can imagine the New York Times editor, New York Times shut down, and editor is in Canada in exile, something like that. So I was trying to tell them that this is life. You know, when you have a pain in your stomach or in your head or some part of your body, you go to doctor, and doctor says, sorry, you have 6 months life. So this is something like that. So this is a kind of political cancer that I faced, and a lot of my colleagues are facing still. Of course, it's not the end of the world. We continue to struggle to be the voice of people still. A lot of my friends are now very active in exile. I have a YouTube program, for instance, with an exiled academic. So it's not just the journalists were persecuted. 7,000 academics were purged in last 7 years, 7,000. So one of them is living in Canada like me. So we do a program. It's in Turkish now, and we try to share what's happening in the world and in Turkey to reach out to people. So we use social media, but we're not even feeling safe outside the country. So the oppression is so terrible and not understandable. It's a NATO country. It's the founder of the European Council, Turkey, you know. So a lot of my friends has been attacked in Germany, in Sweden, in some other countries. There's exiled colleagues of mine. Their only purpose is to continue telling the truth. So it's not easy, of course. I mean, my whole life toppled down. But I mean, this is one of the resilience and the beauty of the human beings. We adapt to even the worst cases. And so I try to be hope to people that are in a worse situation than me. You know, there are my friends who are in solitary confinement for 7 years. Can you imagine? I am in a very big luxury comparatively. So I try to stand tall and be source of hope for those who are in a worse situation. And please, you do your part. I mean, not just in Turkey, but around the world. Oppression, unfortunately, the rise of authoritarianism is a kind of global trend. I wish we could have time to talk why. But this is another global cancer. Thank you very much.
I am Manashwini. I came from India. How can I achieve gender equality? Can you prefer anything to me?
Gender equality, that's a tough question. I don't know if we can achieve gender equality easily. It's something that evades us, even in the best and even in the most progressive societies. Women get paid less, they participate less in politics, they participate less in the public sphere. One of the answers is that youth, young people, have the power to change things.
You are going to face things that none of us will have to, and none of us had to. So you're going to come back here and teach us how to do it. Because the challenges that you're facing are greater than anything I ever did. So you'll come back here in 10 years and you'll teach me, okay?
I like that answer. It brings to mind my 89-year-old mother who's been fighting since the 1960s and 70s for gender pay equity. And it depresses me that you have to ask at your age what you can do to achieve gender equality when women have been fighting for so many decades to achieve it. I think we heard from the previous panel that data is one of the most important ways through which we can wage this battle for equality, because we need to know the statistics in order to know where the inequities are. But I would encourage you to find optimism where you can, and I too look forward to the lessons that you'll be able to teach us in a few years' time, and good luck.
I did a little, when I had chance, my part to help gender equality. When I was the CEO of the media group that has a news agency, several newspapers and TV channels, etc., I picked a female journalist to be editor-in-chief of one of my newspapers. So this was the first time that a lady, a female, became the editor-in-chief in Turkey. So whenever we have chance, we need to do our best to solve the problem. And Journalists and Writers Foundation, meanwhile, is doing their best by putting me just one male among 5 females, which is a good attempt. Thank you.
There's no one way to answer the question, to be honest. But as a young person and a scout, what I will tell you to do is, in scouting we have something called being thrifty. So look at what resources you have to be able to make the small change that you can around you. Look at the issues that are contributing to this gender inequality. Is it issues to do with sexual reproductive health and rights? Identify that and see what resources you have, who you can be able to bring on board to be able to effect that change, however small. Don't look at the bigger picture of changing the whole world. Start from wherever it is that you are and let the external stakeholders do what they can if they want to come on board. Join movements that are contributing to this kind of a thing. I'm not telling you to be a scout, but be part of people that want to make that specific change. Start small. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Batya. So I really appreciated how your talk kind of showed how freedom of the press is an issue that goes beyond political divides, and how whether you're on the left or you're on the right, this is an issue that we should all care about. So my question for you is, like, how do we unite the right and the left to see that freedom of press is something that we all need to protect? Because if it's not protected on one side, it can't protect any of us.
Thank you so much for the question. The good news is that the division and divisiveness in this country is like completely localized at the top. So I just spent the year traveling the country interviewing working class people for my next book, and I could tell you, like, the working class of this country is like 75% of this country. They are not politically polarized. They're not divided. They want a press that respects them. They want a press that doesn't erase their values, which unfortunately is something that happens a lot. But they don't hate the press. They don't hate people who vote for different parties. They're very post-partisan. The polarization is all totally concentrated in the elites because the elites benefit from it. So the media elites and the political elites get power from convincing people to hate the other side, right? It's like tales old as time, right? Like I like to tell people, which is true, that every time you get angry at a stranger on the internet, someone just made $1 million in Silicon Valley. Like, they literally created apps to make us hate strangers. Like, it's not natural to hate a stranger at that level. And so the good news is that polarization, that extremity of emotion over politics is a totally elite phenomenon. The bad news is it's an elite phenomenon and the elites control a lot of what's going on. So I would say, like, the way we fight that is just like respect your fellow man. It's like the most basic thing. Do the thing that that reduces your own power. I mean, that's basically the end of it, is like that instinct you have to sort of like get that power by making people hate somebody else. Like, just say, you know what, I'm going to respect this person enough to just say, here's what I found and you do with that what you will. And I think so it's sort of, the problem is a lot less entrenched, but also is something that every single one of us can do every single day.
Thank you all. Thanks to our distinguished panelists and to the audience.
Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Panel discussion 3 will start in a couple minutes as we change the panelists' desk. Thank you so much.